Just by way of reminder, sort of to set everything in place, Paul left Silas and Timothy somewhere in Macedonia, in the area of Thessalonica, and in that area, Berea maybe. But then he spent some time, maybe some months. He was in Athens by himself, and then he went to Corinth. If he took a ship, that was the way to go. It would have been a lot easier trip if he had taken a ship from Piraeus, which is the capital, or the seaport of the city of Athens. And so he could have taken a ship down from there to where the Isthmian Games were held. And if he went that way, it would be a fairly easy, quick journey. But if he went by way overland of the isthmus that connected with Corinth, then he would have had a long uphill walk and then downhill, and it was a poor road, and it was a terrible way. And so if he walked, it would have been a long trip for him. If he took a ship, presumably he would have taken a ship. It appears that Paul has some independent sources of money himself, in addition to what he received in help from churches. And so he would have come, at one way or another, he came first to Isthmia, where the games were held. Even if he went overland, he would pass by that site, and then he would travel on to Corinth another 3 or 4 miles. When he got in Corinth, of course, it was like Athens or Thessalonica. Paul went into the city not knowing anybody who was a Christian. He apparently somehow came across Aquila and Priscilla by their common trade, I guess, although there may have been other tent makers in the town. But somehow he became acquainted with them. I suppose they were Jews. Maybe through the synagogue he became acquainted with them. And so Paul worked with them for a time. Aquila and Priscilla apparently were already Christians before Paul met them. That is, there's nothing said about their ever being converted by Paul to Christ. There are various times that he mentions the first fruits of Achaia, and there's no indication that Aquila and Priscilla were in that group. And so it could well be that when he met them, they were already Christians. They had come from Rome to Corinth. And there were Romans, of course, at Jerusalem during the Feast of Pentecost. And so there may have been some people who were converted to Christ during that period of time. And so Paul worked with them for a time, but at the same time he was a teacher. And so you can imagine that he found occasions where he taught people. I've been in places, large cities in Europe, where there would be a congregation that met there, maybe some people who were old Christians. And I've wondered if they weren't maybe products from World War II or something like that. But at any rate, there were, in Italy and in Germany, there would be some Christians that were there who had been Christians for some time. And the missionaries worked with them, of course, to try to find open doors in the city for further teaching of the gospel. But I expect it was something like that for Paul, that when he came into Corinth, he met Aquila and Priscilla. They already were Christians. They were Jews, of course. And so Paul knew something about them. They had a good number of things besides their common trade in being tent makers. Or the word actually in Greek means worker in leather goods. And so they may have worked at other things besides making tents. But Paul stayed with them sometime. And then Silas and Timothy, who had been in Macedonia, came down. No doubt they came to Athens first, And then they came on over to Corinth. They learned that Paul was in Corinth. They might have learned from Christians who were in Athens already. There are some people that are spoken of right at the end of Acts, 16, where Paul first teaches, or first comes to Corinth, and I expect that Silas and Timothy followed his same route, and so they came to Corinth, and from them Paul learned of developments in the church at Thessalonica first. Maybe he also learned something about Philippi. Though Luke was at Philippi, you might remember that the we sections in Acts, the first of the we sections, stops at Philippi. And so Luke may well have stayed behind there. But Timothy and Silas had worked among other churches throughout Macedonia. And they came to Paul. Paul was best acquainted, of course, with the church at Thessalonica and Berea. And so they reported to Paul some of the developments in the church at Thessalonica, especially because Paul was writing to the Thessalonians. That's where we're studying in 1 Thessalonians. But Paul, having learned from them, from Timothy and Silas, some of the developments in the church, wrote them a letter. There were two things in particular that Paul addressed, and we'll get into one of them next week. But one of them was the idolatry that was in the city, and the Jews that opposed what Paul taught Gentiles and Jews both to come to Christ in the same way. But some of the Jewish Christians, especially, the Jews became more and more suspicious of Paul. You remember that he had 3 Sabbath days that he went into the synagogue, but I expect that Paul stayed there, that stayed in Thessalonica, and tried to teach people for much longer than 3 Sabbath days. But for 3 Sabbaths at least, he went into the synagogue. And it was there that he met some opposition. The only person who is mentioned by name who is a Christian in Thessalonica is Jason, and nothing is said about his conversion. Now remember, that's to be contrasted with, say, Philippi, where Paul met Lydia beside the river and taught her and her family. I suspect from what is said, especially from some of the Greek words that are used, I suspect that Lydia was a pious believer. She was one of those people who were sort of loosely attached to the synagogue without ever becoming a Jew all the way. As many people were, they were pious ones, pious Greeks, some of the translations will say of them. And so, but there's Lydia and then the jailer. We have at least those 2 people, and the circumstances under which they were converted to Christ. And so something is said about them. Very little is said about Jason. And Jason is the only one at Thessalonica who is mentioned by name. Now there may have been, and I suspect there were others that were part of the congregation, but little is said about them. I thought about, as I was looking at this lesson, how in Acts chapter 20, when Paul is leaving the city of Corinth on it would have been on his 3rd journey when he's taking up a collection, it says it mentions some of the people that traveled with Paul from the city of Corinth. And when he'd gone through these districts, meaning Macedonia and down to Achaia where Corinth was, and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. Well, Greece seems to be a general term here for maybe the Peloponnese or that area to the south. It was thought of as Greece in a special way, the ancient world. So he came to Greece, and he spent 3 months there, and when a plot was formed against him by the Jews, and I find that really interesting. You see that the Jews are already ready to kill him at that point. But Paul hears of the plot and he leaves. But it says that he was accompanied by Sopater of Berea, the son of Piraeus, and by Aristarchus and Secundus. They were Christians of the Thessalonians. And so there are at least those two that are mentioned. And possibly they had been Christians sometimes. Possibly Titus and Silas converted them. So they were a part of the church there. So at least we have these two people who are mentioned by name, Aristarchus and Secundus. Of course, Secundus is a Latin word that means second. And I've mentioned to you before maybe that the Latins, the Romans, had a way of doing that. A second child they named Secundus. Second, he is the second. And they did that with many. There are several numbers like this mentioned in the Bible where names are given to people based on the order of their birth, apparently. And so Paul stays in Athens then with Titus and Silas. It says that when he learned developments of the church there, but more important, Paul was allowed a little more freedom. The church at Thessalonica and Berea, and maybe some of the other churches, had sent a traveling fund or a working fund to Paul. That's what missionaries, at least in these days, would call it. And so Paul was able to move out of the synagogue. I've always thought that in Acts there's a lot of sort of insights into Jewish and Christian living in those worlds if you read it carefully. We do know from archaeological work that many times synagogues, especially old and well-established synagogues, would have a guest room attached. Normally a traveler would be there only a day or two and would stay in the guest room and then go on his way. But in Paul's case, he was there longer, and so I expect that he was staying in something of a guest room like that, close by the synagogue. But he ran into some trouble with the synagogue about this time, with Silas and Timothy providing him some funds. He changed his place of residence, and he continued to work with the church there. But he wasn't as closely attached to Aquila and Priscilla as he had been before. And so Paul works in Corinth, continues to work with Timothy and Silas beside him and giving him encouragement as he tried to build up the church. And as he did build up the church, we know more about the church at Corinth probably than any other place. But from what he learned of the church in Thessalonica, from Timothy and Silas, Paul wrote them the letter trying to encourage them, trying to encourage the church. Our assignment today starts with the 13th verse of the 2nd chapter. For this reason, we also constantly thank God, Paul says, and he's writing to the Thessalonians. We thank him on behalf of you for what you have heard, and because you had accepted what we had taught. The early Christians, Paul and others, you can tell from the letters, that one of the things that bothers them is when Christ is preached, there are some people who accept Christ and some who do not. Why do some accept and some not? If all are under the condemnation of sin, you see. And so Paul deals with it. We're thankful that you accepted, you, meaning the church there at Thessalonica, that you accepted the things that we had to say and what we said as being from God and not from men. And so the church there grew and prospered. But there's something of a lesson, isn't there, for all of us, that in Scripture, in words that Paul writes in the letters, And in other places, of course, all the New Testament are not letters of Paul. But in what the New Testament has to say, we learn too, and we accept what has been said and written down as canon. That is, it is from God. It measures up. That's what the word canon means. It's like a reed. It measures up. And so the New Testament is a word from God and not from men. And Paul says that he's thankful for the way they have accepted it. For you, brethren, he says, became imitators of the church of God in Jesus Christ that are in Judea. For you also endured the same suffering at the hand of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews. This is the only place in the second chapter of Thessalonians. It's the only place in Paul's letters where there is a direct connection made between the Jews and their persecuting of Christians in Thessalonica or at some other place in the Hellenized world that would have been different from, that would have been the same as the situation in Judea. Now, I have mentioned several times here and elsewhere that in my opinion, one of the first early controversies of the church, a bitter controversy, was Jewish Christians who insisted that Gentiles in their coming to Christ had to come through Judaism first. They had to become Jews and then they became Christians. A Jew was eligible to become a Christian, but not a Gentile. And Paul, of course, would have none of that. Paul and Barnabas and other teachers of that time that Paul would have approved. They insisted that, or they maintained that a Gentile could come to Christ on the same basis as a Christian, had the same, or as a Jew, had the same decision to make. And here in the second chapter of Thessalonians, Paul says, you can understand what your brethren, brothers and sisters in Christ, in Judea suffered at the hands of the Jews, because you have suffered the same thing from your countrymen. Remember how the book of Acts tells about certain Jews who went into the marketplace and found worthless fellows idling about and hired them as something of a mob, and they drug Jason, the only Christian who is mentioned by name in the book of Acts, at least. Well, I guess these two that I've mentioned before are in Acts, and so they're not the only ones in Acts, but at least in the context of Paul's establishing the church, Jason is the only one who is mentioned. And so the church at Thessalonica is made up, I would suppose, largely of Gentile converts. At least Alexander is certainly a Greek name, and Secundus is a Latin word at least. And so I would suppose that from Gentiles who have come to Christ, the church at Thessalonica has pretty much partaken of, or is made up of Gentile Christians, some Jews that were led to Christ, but not too many. That the church at Thessalonica is pretty much a Gentile church. And so Paul says, I labored among you, I worked among you, I earned my own way. I didn't want to be a burden to anybody that was there. And so Paul was worked while he was in Thessalonica and assured them that he was not of the type of the traveling teacher philosophers that went from city to city, held out in the marketplaces. Paul was a different kind of teacher. He was building a community. He didn't want a personal following so much as he wanted the people who heard him to follow Jesus. And so the church came into being there, and Paul is writing to them about their own conversion to Christ and about the parallels between their development as the church and the church in Judea. But Paul says, "We, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short while, in person, not in spirit." It is clear when Paul writes his letters that he's doing a lot more than simply giving another way of life or another God to the Greeks. We could think, of course, that if 5 gods were good, then 6 gods would be that much better. And the Greeks, in the Greek-speaking world, they adopted over the centuries many gods into their pantheon that had nothing whatsoever to do with the old Greek gods, people like Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and so forth. And so there had been many gods introduced into the Greek culture, but Paul wasn't of the type who was satisfied with there being simply people now who worship Jesus, and in some cases in addition to other gods. Paul wanted to convince them first that Jesus was the Son of the one true God that the Jews had spoken to them about. And so to that extent, the stepping stone of Paul into the churches, into the cultures of cities like Athens and Corinth and Thessalonica and Berea, that the stepping stone came to be the synagogues. He went to the synagogues first. In Romans, he says to the Jew first and also to the Gentiles. He went first of all to his own people. And so the Jews were a priority in that sense. That is, they had a long history with the God of Israel. And so when Paul found the synagogue, he converted some of them that God had fulfilled his promises and given them the Christ, that he was a Christ, as it says of Thessalonians. Thessalonians, he taught that the Christ, when he came, had to suffer, not reign. He wasn't going to be like David in that sense. He wouldn't compete with the Romans or with people like Alexander the Great or Philip of Macedon. He didn't fight with the Greeks or with the Romans, but Paul showed them Christ, the Son of God, that the people of Israel had a long history with the God who had chosen them, and that Jesus was the one that one true God had promised along through the centuries. And they had accepted that Jesus was the Christ, that he was sent of God. And Paul was thankful that they had accepted his words as the words that they truly were, words from God and not simply words from men. But Paul, in addition to all of those things, Paul established a personal relationship with the churches. He wasn't content, even if they continued to serve and to worship the God, Jesus, as the Christ. Paul wanted to write to them, to give them instruction. There was no New Testament. There were 2 things: what Paul said while he was with them and the example that he set, the way that he lived. And so he continually calls on them, be imitators of me. You have seen what Christian living is like. You worship one God, the one God of Israel, Jesus, the God the Father, and Jesus Christ was his Son, the Messiah, the promised one, the anointed one that God had promised to send. And so Jesus had to suffer, and that Jesus was the Christ. Those were the 2 things that Paul established at Thessalonica, and it was wherever he went, that was the thing he wanted to do. But he wanted them to know him. I have committed my life to Jesus, and I want you to commit yours, because there is only one God and one Christ. And so he did this from city to city, and of course built up a string of churches. Who among the Greeks would have thought that the most significant thing that was happening in their town was that one of the apostles of Christ should be there, and that beginning with the Jews and branching out to the Gentiles, he was leading them in 300 years, by the time of Constantine. In 300 years, the world, the official religion of the Roman Empire, would be Christianity. And it's a wonderful story. It's a story that I think is unequaled in the stories of humankind. Thank you for the attention you've given me today, and we hope, as long as Whitney can hold out, that we will have a lesson as long as the pandemic, at least, its effects are being felt in the churches at El Paso and other places. Thank you.